Welcome to the China's Global Energy Finance Database Fall 2023 Data Update webinar, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The GDP Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. I'm Onyi Tarela Moses, or Tarela for short, and I'm a data analyst and database manager with the Global China Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. As the world recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, and as costs of renewable energy decrease, China's established financial and technical prowess is uniquely positioned to foster green energy transitions abroad. At the recent third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, China indicated significant support for scaling up overseas green energy-related activities, with fresh capital allocated to finance the next decade of the Belt and Road Initiative and the creation of a green investment and finance partnership to help BRI partner countries develop and match green projects with Chinese financiers. The announcements build on Chinese leader Xi Jinping's 2021 announcement that China would no longer build new coal-fired power plants overseas and instead would seek to ramp up support for renewable energy in developing countries. However, our new update to the China's Global Energy Finance Database, managed by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, reveals that a shift in Chinese overseas energy finance for renewable energy has yet to emerge. The CGEF database identifies international sovereign loans for the energy sector overseas, which means the recipient is a public entity, public majority owned, or a private entity with a sovereign guarantee on a loan. In the 2 years since Xi's announcement, the CGF database has identified no new overseas energy sector loan commitments from China's development finance institutions to foreign government borrowers. What trends characterize the 22 years of data tracked in the CGF database, and which countries and energy subsectors have received the most financing? What are the prospects for a greener horizon? Today, we are joined by our researchers on Chinese overseas energy finance who will provide commentary and contextualize the findings from their latest data update and policy brief. They are Cecilia Springer, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Global China Initiative, and Ashana Ratan, who is a Global China pre-doctoral research fellow with the Global China Initiative. To begin, Cecilia and Ashana will first present key findings from this year's data update, and then I will give a demonstration on how to use the database. After that, we will launch into a discussion followed by Q&A. Before we get started, I do want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording is immediately accessible after the end of this webinar. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask your questions, and please also give your name and affiliation. Please feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion. And with that, I'll hand it over to Cecilia and Ishana.
Thank you, Tarela, and hello to our audience. I'll be sharing some slides to share some of the latest findings from our database update and some of the trends behind the data. So just to give an outline of what we'll be talking about today, I'll start with an overview of the latest trends. We'll go through the methodology and some of the updates made in this year's iteration of the database. We'll talk about drivers of a recent decline in China's global energy finance, and then end with a discussion on prospects for greener energy finance overseas. So just to start with some of the key data and trends, our headline number from this year's compilation of the database is that China has provided $225 billion in overseas development finance lending commitments for energy projects around the world for the time period tracked in our database from 2000 to 2022. And just to reiterate the scope and definition of our database, we track international sovereign loans for the energy sector overseas from China's two development finance institutions, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. So that means that the recipient entities are public entities, public majority owned, or private entities with a sovereign guarantee on the loan. So breaking down that headline number of $225 billion over time, we can see that there's been a pretty steep decline in recent years, and actually 2022 marks the second year in a row that China's development finance institutions did not issue new lending commitments for the energy sector overseas. And even though we can see this steep decline, it's important to note that past lending commitments have accumulated a very large stock of Chinese financial support for the energy sector overseas, and that just looking at the 5-year time period from that peak in 2016 until now, the collective energy finance provided over those 5 years still outstrips contributions from other prominent development finance institutions, such as the World Bank. And so just from 2016 onwards, China's development finance institutions distributed 87 loans valued at about 76 billion to 25 different public borrowers within the energy sector. And so this surpasses the energy sector lending offered to public entities by any other global lender, and significantly outpaces the cumulative energy sector lending by the World Bank over that time frame. So down but not out for sure, looking at these trends over time, and remembering that this is still a substantial amount, even though the past 2 years have been quiet. So looking at some trends on the energy sources and subsectors that we track in this database, we track a number of different energy sources from fossil fuels like coal, gas, and oil to low carbon energy and renewable energy sources. And we also track how these map onto different energy subsectors like electric power generation, exploration and extraction upstream for different energy resources, and so on. And so what we find is that the largest share of loan commitments from China's development finance institutions has been to exploration and extraction activities in the energy sector. And within that, that has mostly been for oil exploration extraction. And power generation was the energy subsector receiving the second largest amount of lending commitments. In terms of energy sources, fossil fuels have been the dominant destination for China's energy development finance in the past, representing about 73% of the amount of lending tracked in the database for coal, oil, and gas. And oil was the largest energy source overall. And I'll pass it to Ashana to share a little bit more about how we compiled the database this year and some of our updates.
Great. So I'll be providing an overview of our database methodology. To reiterate the scope of the database, we are identifying international sovereign loans for the energy sector overseas. So all recipients are public entities, public majority owned, or private entity with a sovereign guarantee on a loan. So this year's update uses both an algorithmic and a manual approach to identify new loans. So we draw on two main databases for the algorithmic web scraping component of our database update. And we web scrape news articles from Microsoft Azure using their API and GDALT. And we use these two because on one hand, Microsoft Azure has great coverage and is quite accurate in terms of false positives, but unfortunately biased towards English language sources. So to complement this, we use GDALT, which has more non-English language sources, but has more false positives. So between these two, we use a series of terms to identify Chinese development finance. So we include both China and development, as well as permutations of export-import to indicate development finance from Chinese institutions to identify potential hits. We also include the names of borrowing countries. And in addition to English, we search in local language scripts and include energy-specific keywords in Chinese so that we can get the best coverage of Chinese language sources. And so from this bank of potential results, we aggregate potential hits into an interface that allows us to filter out false positives. Within this interface, we use additional algorithms and keyword searches to identify articles that might contain our keywords, but don't talk about development finance. For example, lots of personal finance sites like badcredit.org get caught up in the web scrape, but we can quickly filter those out using additional keyword searches. And then from here, all of the sort of good hits, the best hits, are added to the database, and then we provide additional sourcing next. So after the algorithmic portion, we additionally conduct manual searches. So we've built a source library of key host country government and ministry websites relevant to the energy sector to systematically manually check pages that might not typically come up in our web scrape, like host country government ministries, state-owned enterprises, and other official state-owned media. And so we use these manual searches to identify potential new loans for the database update. After we compile both algorithmic hits and hits from the manual searches, we then double verify all projects with two sources, one that is Chinese language and the other from a third party. And we confirm that the loan was made, that the project is operational and on track rather than canceled, and that the China Development Bank or Ex-Import Bank was involved. And so we strive to find at least one Chinese language source and one external source, for example, credible news articles or host country government documents, and other credible policy reports. And of course, we archive sources online so that everyone can see them afterwards, even if the original link changes. And as we're sourcing, we prioritize government documents, embassies, and other official Chinese sources, as well as company SEC filings, then before turning to credible news outlets like Renewables Now or Hydro Review, for example. And again, these sources all confirm that projects are existing and on track, and the presence of a loan commitment. And so this is our methodology to ensure that all sources are credible and accurate. All right, back to you, Cecilia.
Thanks, Shoshana. So now you all know how our databases were assembled and some of the key trends. So next I'll dive into some of the drivers of the decline that we've seen in recent years for China's global energy finance. So the first set of drivers that we see of this decline is within China. They're still experiencing the ongoing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially the economic effects. So until the beginning of this year, there were travel restrictions that limited the ability to conduct cross-border activities and negotiate large infrastructure packages. There's also been, a dampening and growth in China's GDP. And China's development finance institutions have been focused towards bolstering domestic economic growth rather than continuing to lend overseas. In addition, it's important to note that even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the regulatory landscape in China was shifting towards more risk-averse lending practices overseas. And there had been, additional regulations, for example, from the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission to this end aimed at risk mitigation for overseas lending. On the host country side, it's important to note that, host countries play a large role in determining what kinds of deals get struck, and that certain countries are facing rising debt to GDP ratios and experiencing debt distress. So this limits their ability to borrow for new projects while managing existing loans, even for much needed energy infrastructure. And then lastly, something that we've been tracking at the GDP Center is China's shifting overseas strategy, where development finance as a whole has been moving towards a so-called, in their words, small is beautiful approach, and projects with smaller geographic footprints, as well as the overall more risk-averse lending practices. And this year, when we were writing our policy brief that came out alongside the database, we also wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some of the drivers behind specific projects and how that might affect learning over time that could drive some of decision making at a big picture level. So Some additional GDP Center research investigated a data set of Chinese invested power plants around the world and found that there have been many instances of project suspensions and cancellations in the electric power sector, which is a subsector of energy writ large. And that coal and hydropower projects have had higher suspension rates compared to wind and solar projects, which is not to say that wind and solar projects don't face these kinds of issues, but all else equal at a lower rate than coal and hydropower. And the suspension rate for coal projects has been positively correlated with environmental factors like climate-related vulnerability and the presence of environmental protests. And for hydropower projects, suspension and cancellation has been associated with proximity to protected areas. And we did a few sort of mini case studies in the policy brief. For example, pictured here is the Mazardudas hydropower plant in Ecuador, which was meant to consist of 3 units totaling 21 megawatts of power generating capacity. China Development Bank had supported this plant with a loan commitment in 2011 with a Chinese contractor, contracted for project construction. However, only one of the units ended up being commissioned in 2017. And then the other 2 are sort of in a state of indefinite delay. There were issues with contract termination with the Electric Corporation of Ecuador. And the broader context is that Chinese development finance for hydropower development in Ecuador has broadly encountered many issues, including allegations of cost overruns, construction quality issues, and then Ecuador's ongoing state of debt distress. Also looking at coal specifically, this pictured here is the Tuzla coal plant in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is one of the older and the largest coal-fired power plant in the country. And just last year was seeking an expansion, which would have been supported by a loan from the Export-Import Bank of China. And this expansion encountered many issues. The country's State Aid Council revoked approval of the public guarantee. There was local pushback. And then in addition, China had its own major no coal policy announcement, which I'll discuss more later, that also made it murky whether or not this project would fall in line with policy guidances for China to not build new coal plants overseas. And so in the end, the host country did play probably the larger role in suspending this arrangement. But any expansions to the Tuzla coal plant going forward are unlikely to involve China's development finance institutions. So overall, the dynamics of suspension and cancellation in China's overseas energy projects show that evolving environmental and social sensitivities, both within host countries and China's own policy framework, underscore a shift in the global energy landscape. And we think that both host countries and China are increasingly prioritizing sustainable development considerations, which in the energy sector means a shift towards lower carbon, greener projects. And to that end, I'll wrap up the presentation by assessing prospects for greener energy finance. So starting with what we've tracked in the database so far, the actual composition of energy projects receiving developments from China has not yet shifted significantly away from that 73% fossil fuel number that I cited earlier. Our database tracks almost $2 billion in development finance out of the total $225 billion for renewable energy projects. So here we mean wind, solar, and geothermal. And these together represent about 1 gigawatt in installed capacity, which is much lower, for example, than the 12 gigawatts of renewable energy that we track in another database, the China's Global Power Database, where that 12 gigawatts has received foreign direct investment from Chinese companies. So this $2 billion, this $1.8 billion here is distributed from 2010 to 2017. So in our policy brief, we also wanted to discuss, why has finance been so low overall, and why hasn't there been more in recent years? So we have a couple of reasons why. First, as renewable energy costs have dropped, a wider range of investors have been attracted to the market, and development finance institutions aren't necessarily driving the massive growth that's happening around the world right now. Furthermore, a lot of host countries, a lot of developing countries have typically looked to multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, for renewable energy financing, potentially due to pre-existing renewable energy projects in an earlier phase of the renewable energy boom. In addition, China's DFIs have expressed hesitation in the past about the bankability of solar and wind projects abroad. They are typically smaller in capacity than, for example, the coal and hydropower that represent the largest share of China's involvement in the overseas power sector. And renewable projects may not be grid connected, or they may be in areas with poor grid infrastructure, leading China's development finance institutions to potentially perceive them as riskier. However, we argue that China's development finance institutions are well positioned to scale up renewable energy financing, especially based on their significant domestic experience, bolstering China's domestic solar industry, even through the global financial crisis. The Chinese solar industry really started to take off around then, indicating that China's DFIs are able to support a growing industry even in a time of difficulty in financial stability. And we also want to highlight that there are ongoing policy announcements that indicate there may be a greener horizon for China's global energy finance. So, as I mentioned earlier, first in 2021, Chinese leader Xi Jinping made a major announcement at the UN General Assembly that China would step up support for green and low carbon energy overseas. And then this kind of leads, in a direct line to last month's announcement at the Belt and Road Forum, the third Belt and Road Forum, of the new Green Investment and Financing Partnership, which is really a step towards defining mechanisms for achieving the stated goal that was made in 2021. So, we think that China's development finance institutions can play a catalytic role in stepping up support for green and low carbon energy. There are an increasing array of financial mechanisms to do so. And it doesn't also necessarily mean direct financing of, renewable energy installation. There's a wide range of ways that China can be involved in emerging green energy supply chains. We don't find those kinds of upstream involvements in the China's Global Energy Finance database, but we do think that China's development finance institutions are well positioned to create holistic packages that support green energy deployment. For example, they've also provided a very large amount of finance to transmission and distribution. Grid upgrades and energy efficiency are all tracked in our database, and those are necessary to the deployment and integration of renewable energy. And then finally, also noting as our investigation into project suspensions and cancellations shows that future scale-up also needs to be paired with addressing some of the social and environmental issues that have come up in the past for energy sector projects. So I just want to acknowledge, to conclude, our excellent team. In addition to Tarela and Ishana, we also had 3 wonderful research assistants, Jia, Nathan, and Raquel. So just want to acknowledge all the hard work that went into this year's database update. And we look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia and Ishana. So now I'll just share my screen here to walk you through our interactive that displays this new database update. So hopefully everyone can now see my screen. And let me just walk you all through. So when you first come to this URL right here, you will be met with a little bit of background and information about China's global energy finance database, which gives you the scope of this data. You can click Explore, which will take you to the first page, which is just a map that shows all the different countries that have received energy finance from China's two development finance institutions, CDB and CHESM. So at first, if you want to look at how much financing has gone to different regions for different energy sources, subsectors, and lenders, you could click into each of these tabs, and different types of depictions will show up for each region. For example, you see subsectors here broken out by region, and then you also see the different lenders that have also directed financing to the various regions in our database. So you can do this in this way. You can also click down here to my left-hand side on this globe icon. And what happens is that this map updates, and below you can scroll down and first see a bar graph of the distribution of financing over the 22 years that we cover. And then there are also lists of projects based on energy sources that you can click into and get quick tidbits about specific loans and who the borrower would be, lender would be, energy source, and energy subsector information as well. You can do this by also clicking into specific years. For example, if we just looked at 2019, the map updates, and so does the bar graph and information below. And you could also look at this depiction by clicking into a country. So if I clicked here into Brazil, the map updates again, and I'm able to see the distribution of loans to Brazil over this time period. Specifically, that's what's highlighted is the year 2019, which I clicked earlier, and below you'll see the one project that received financing during this year, 2019, in Brazil. So if we scroll up here, the last thing I wanted to show you is our About Data download page, which gives you insight again into this database that provides a scope. It provides the related databases where you may find overlap between some of the entries that are in the CGF database and others that we also publish. And if you scroll down, you'll be able to access links to our policy briefs, as well as our database methodology guidebook, if you wanted to dig deeper into the various methodologies that Ishana mentioned earlier. This 2023 policy brief gives more detail and goes even deeper into some of the highlights that Cecilia discussed today. So I highly recommend looking into that. And then if you scroll down further, you'll be able to put your information in to access a link to download the data. And that link should come to your email once you input all your information. So as you're looking through this database, if there are entries that you have questions about or any suggestions that you would like to provide, please feel free to reach out to me at odm@bu.edu. And if there are any immediate inquiries, please feel free to reach out to Maureen Height at mheight@bu.edu. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and let's launch into some discussion questions. As I ask a few questions to our researchers here, please feel free to add Q&A or questions into the Q&A box. So just to kick us off here, my first question is related to kind of comparing this year's database with last year's update. Cecilia and Ashana, could you provide some of the key differences between this update and last year's update?
Yeah, I can start. I think some of the major enhancements that we made to this year's methodology include expanding our use of Chinese language, energy-specific keywords in our algorithmic search, which is important again for our focus on the energy sector. We also with Tarla's guidance, expanded our source library for energy-specific sources, where there may be certain news sites or information aggregators that are specific to the energy sector and are more appropriate for looking specifically at energy projects rather than development or infrastructure finance writ large. And I will see if Ishana has anything to add to those enhancements.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add is that we then adopted standardized definitions for energy subsectors, drawing on the North American industry classification system to keep this consistent.
Great. So it sounds like there was some harmonization and just consistency created across the database, and then enhancements to the methodology. So Cecilia, you discussed, more about your confidence in China's DFI's positions to support green and low carbon energy overseas. Could you expand on this more and maybe perhaps provide some examples or thoughts that you had?
Yeah, I think what I find very exciting is that our research shows that these development finance institutions do have significant experience bolstering China's domestic renewable energy industry, as I mentioned. But until recently, there wasn't really any sign that that was translating into support for renewable energy projects abroad. But what I find really exciting is that those two institutions, China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank of China, are listed as supporters of this emerging green investment and financing partnership that was announced at the Belt and Road Forum. And I think that, under the new framework of Small is Beautiful and the Global Development Initiative, that there may be kind of alternative ways for these development finance institutions to leverage their experience rather than kind of the traditional model of large scale infrastructure lending and packages. So I think it's all very early stage how that experience is going to be called upon, but it's definitely something that we should all be watching.
Understood. So it sounds like a lot of the parts, mechanisms are ready to go. So it's a matter of time to watch and see what comes up in terms of the DFI's abilities to support green and low carbon energy overseas. So my last question that I want to launch into before we go into Q&A is to kind of think through some of the potential benefits and risks of China's increasing support for green and low carbon energy overseas. So, if China continues to, or in future years, scale up the support, might these projects encounter some of the same social and environmental issues that we have seen in the past, especially with fossil fuel related projects?
Yeah, I think I can start in terms of thinking about risks. I think it's really important to break down these risks along the energy supply chain. And so, for example, in the upstream part of the supply chain where resources are being extracted, this is typically extremely resource intensive, entails a lot of land transformation, whether you're extracting traditional fossil fuels or, for example, transition materials that go into green energy and green technologies. And so, for example, there's been a lot of attention to China's involvement, not through the development finance institutions, but through other kinds of institutions and investors in these new sort of transition material supply chains. For example, cobalt that goes into electric vehicle batteries being mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Those kinds of new energy supply chains have received a lot of attention. And in fact, even though they're different materials, bear many of the same risks as traditional extractive activities. And, you know, likewise, midstream, so this is like transmission and distribution, moving energy around through pipelines or the electric grid. I think whether you're moving fossil energy or green energy also is often very land and resource intensive, although, you know, there's a pipeline is very different than like a transmission grid or something like that, but the risks also need to be considered. And finally, downstream, when it comes to electric power generation, even wind and solar require a lot of land. We've seen a lot of recent controversies about offshore wind development in some countries. So all of which is to say that the risks of green energy are not necessarily any less than that of traditional energy. And so as China's development finance institutions hopefully get more involved in scaling up, they also need to learn from the past, learn from experiences with brown energy to make sure that the development is more sustainable and, you know, from a social and environmental perspective, less impactful. There are also many benefits, potentially even greater distributional benefits of renewable energy. And I might ask Ishana to speak on that briefly because she has a working paper in this area, but just to give some, you know, top line takeaways, you know, renewable energy can also contribute to economic growth as an energy source. And, you know, there are potentially localized benefits being able to deploy rapidly or at smaller scale relative to traditional, larger centralized power sources. But I'll turn it over to Ashana to talk maybe more about the benefits side.
Right. Wonderful. I'll speak a little bit specifically about potential benefits and opportunities for renewable energy in terms of deployment, because as Cecilia, you rightly mentioned, large-scale renewable energy does tend to have pretty significant impacts on land use, even if it is wind or solar. That being said, I think companies can learn from their experiences with brown energy in terms of what communities are asking for and what communities might hope to benefit from out of the project. And I think that these experiences might be able to serve companies in their new investments in renewable energy in terms of meeting the needs for community and providing infrastructure access in tandem with project construction and so on. And for technology specifically like solar energy, which is relatively modular relative to other types of energy sources, there are opportunities for locals to become trained and work on the projects. Some companies, for example, are providing local educational assistance so that future generations will be able to enter the workforce in the energy space and so on, even if there's a lack of technical capacity. So I think that there are lots of opportunities, specifically with renewable energy, to generate new clean jobs for the future, kind of building on what companies have learned from their experience in other types of energy investments.
Wow, lots to unpack there, which is, I think, very rich. And I would encourage those who want to know more to continue to look at our policy briefs as well as associated working papers on some of these topics. So now I will go to some of our questions that we have in the chat box here. Please feel free to add as many more as you'd like. I'll start off with a question from Jack Whitney from Ernst & Young, and he specifically asks if you all did any research that looked into nuclear energy financing. I'll start with that one, and then also include here a question from Rebecca Ray, one of our senior academic researchers at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And she asks, do you think that wind and solar projects are less likely to face suspension or cancellation because they tend to be smaller in scale, because they are likely to be associated with less controversy from environmental issues, or both. In other words, if Chinese solar and wind finance scales up, is it likely to encounter the same problems as coal and hydro? So I think you all talked about that a little bit more, but maybe more specific to this question if you had additional thoughts.
Great. Yeah, I think I can start with the question about nuclear. So nuclear is one of the energy sources that we track in the China's Global Energy Finance database across different energy subsectors. So we find about $9 billion in China's overseas energy development finance for nuclear energy. Again, this is over the full time span of the database from 2000 to 2022. And the vast majority has been for construction of nuclear power plants, although we did find one relatively small lending commitment for a uranium mine. So mostly downstream involvement, and about $9 billion out of the total 225 billion tracked in the database. And then, yeah, just to expand on our earlier discussion about, what might happen if China's development finance institutions do scale up their involvement in solar and wind, for example. I mean, I'll just reiterate, I don't think that there's a huge difference in the kinds of risks that could be encountered by green energy versus brown energy. I mean, I know there's a large literature out there about, the potential ecological impact of wind turbines and, different kinds of solar plants and different configurations. And I think that, there have been some instances of, controversies with Chinese supported wind and solar projects overseas. So it's not to say that they're perfect. But it may be a factor that there have been so few from China's development finance institutions, and also that they are, relatively speaking, newer than a lot of the traditional energy projects. So, my hypothesis might be that there's been some learning over time, regardless of energy type. And it's also important to note that different actors are involved. So, for example, with coal and hydropower projects, there would be, very large state-owned enterprises, both from the host country and the Chinese side, who may be involved. Really large contracting companies that have a lot of experience in the sector and, may have sort of a certain way of getting things done, versus newer entrants who may or may not be better, but they are newer. And so again, there may be some sort of learning over time, or a different subset of actors are playing a role in different outcomes and implementation. So I think this is a really interesting area for future research, especially as things scale up. It will be very important to safeguard these kinds of newer projects. Ishana, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I'll just jump in and echo a bit of what you've said in terms of course, these projects, the larger the footprint, the larger the impact. So again, with things like solar, there's a bit of optimism in the fact that it is modular. And so maybe projects could be tailored in sort of their footprint to work with communities and so on. But and as you said as well, I think there is very much this learning curve effect, where perhaps with wind and solar, companies that have just started operating in a given host country are less familiar with local institutions and communities. And so over time, I would hope that companies are then able to learn about the impacts of their projects and how communities are perceiving those impacts, and kind of work with local institutions to remedy those, so that sustainable investment can continue over time. And I do think that some of this is likely occurring because there are renewable energy specific companies that are investing that might not have all of the knowledge that companies operating in the energy sector for longer periods of time might. So I think as these new actors learn, then perhaps we'll see mechanisms arise to sort of address the challenges with local communities.
Great. Well, seeing no questions in the chat for now, I have a few burning questions. So I'll use my moderator privilege to ask those as I wait to see if anybody else has any other questions. So I think the first question I have is related to the scope of the database and the lenders that you are looking at. So Ishana has mentioned, the role that companies have to play in also supporting green energy projects. But I was wondering why CGF database has such this narrow scope. What is the purpose of some of that scope? And second, I'm also really curious about, in the context of just looking at DFI financing, what about FDI or financing from companies during the same time period? Have you all looked into that through CGF database or even other databases? And what are we seeing from Chinese companies as DFI financing in the renewable energy space, or just the energy space has declined over the years? And the last question I'll ask is related to kind of this learning that both of you all have been talking about. So yes, Chinese development finance institutions can learn from their past experiences, especially with our projects. But I was wondering if you could also speak about learning from others through co-financing, and if there are any takeaways that Chinese DFIs are already learning, or they could learn for future projects that they could co-finance on.
Yeah, thanks for these questions, Tarala. I'll start with the question on scope and why China's Global Energy Finance Database focuses on lending commitments from China's development finance institutions. I think, first of all, it's really important to ensure comparability with other, publicly available data sets out there, for example, from the World Bank or other multilateral development banks that track the same kind of financing. And so when earlier I was putting in context the amount of energy finance from China's development finance institutions, I could directly compare it to what the World Bank and some other multilateral and national development banks have been doing over the same time period, kind of apples to apples. And if you look at our policy brief from last year's database update, there is a systematic comparison of what China's development finance institutions have done with the World Bank and several others over that time period, again, showing that even though it was on the decline, the accumulated amount was much larger coming from China for the energy sector. I think it's also really important to just hone in on the energy sector. It is the largest destination sector for China's overseas development finance. It's essential for economic growth. There's huge link between energy consumption in countries and kind of their scaling up on the ladder of economic development. But it's also very nuanced. It has this big compositional problem where you can get the same kind of energy from a source with a lot of externalities like fossil fuels that contribute to local air pollution and climate change, or arguably greener sources. And so it's just a very nuanced sector to look at. It's really important to look, break down where in the supply chain these lending commitments are going, as well as to what different energy types. And while our other databases at the GDP Center, many of them, share characteristics with China's global energy finance, they don't get into the same level of detail about the nature of those energy projects. And kind of moving into your second question, we do track foreign direct investment into electric power, one specific subsector of the energy sector in our China's Global Power, or CGP database. We track the amount of capacity, electric power generating capacity that's been financed by Chinese companies around the world. It's a very different methodology, but paints kind of a broader picture within the electric power subsector of what different kinds of Chinese institutions are doing. And we also have a partnership with the World Resources Institute, China's overseas financing inventory, which tracks commercial lending to the electric power projects overseas. So these are also great sources for comparison and kind of looking at different scopes of financial support for energy-related projects overseas. And then to your last question on learning, I think there's some really interesting insights to be gleaned from some forthcoming research that we've been doing, led by former GCI fellow Yang-Si Liu, on the effects of what happens when China co-finances with other institutions overseas. And so, one of the hypotheses that we tested was that when China works with someone else, and specifically an international institution, to co-finance a project, then it has better environmental outcomes. And so, our hypothesis is that's because maybe there's a higher standard that the Chinese institution is achieving when working with an international partner. And we compared that to when China works with another Chinese partner or with a host country partner. So I think it supports the idea that learning is possible, and that co-financing, or even kind of what you might call triangular cooperation, where it's not necessarily direct financing, but other forms of cooperation, can lead to learning and better project level outcomes.
And I'll just briefly jump in and add that in terms of our tracking of foreign direct investment from Chinese companies, we've seen roughly 20 gigawatts of wind and solar investment globally in wind and solar energy. And so it's kind of quite an optimistic signal that perhaps going forward, Chinese companies in partnership with DFIs might be well poised to sort of expand the scope of renewable energy investment.
Well, thank you both. That's quite promising indeed. And I know we're running up here on time. So as we approach the end, I just wanted to give each of you one last word, or even a few words, sentences, paragraphs on your takeaway from this latest update and some of what we can expect looking into the future of China's overseas energy finance. So Cecilia, let's start with you, and then Ishana will also include you.
Great. Yeah, I think, this week I've really been watching what's coming out of the meetings between the US and China, specifically between Biden and Xi on the sidelines of the APEC summit and so on. And I think it was quite heartening to see this Sunnyland statement on climate that both the US and China jointly issued. And I think it, represents kind of a continued upturn or like warming in the US-China climate relationship, which was at a low for a while. And, I think although the statement is mainly focused on both countries working together to achieve their domestic climate priorities, I think there is some language that leaves room open for cooperation for overseas. For example, they mention supporting the goal to triple renewable energy capacity globally by 2030. And both sides are deeply involved in international development and the energy sector overseas. And in a previous working paper published earlier this year by myself and Joanna Lewis at Georgetown University, we lay out a range of options on how the US and China can specifically cooperate on increasing and safeguarding development finance for green energy overseas. So this, is just another step forward, I think, in a working relationship on these topics, which is really important given issues in the other aspects of the US-China relationship. And I think it makes me also think that COP28, the upcoming climate talks, will be a really key moment to watch for further announcements, potentially on US-China cooperation or from China on, further codifying or expanding their, green investment and financing partnership, and how they're going to step up support for green energy overseas. Over to Ashana.
Yeah, I'll just briefly echo that it's quite heartening to see this warming, as Cecilia put it, between U.S.-China relations, and sort of an openness to collaboration, particularly given the findings of our center's research on the potential benefits of co-financing for project outcomes. And I think, echoing a bit of what we discussed earlier, China's very well positioned to use its DFIs to fund renewable energy expansion abroad, particularly given its success in doing so at home. And so as we see both potential for working with the United States and expanding those co-financing and other types of partnerships, in addition to sort of the wealth of experience that China has already built, I think it's a cause for optimism. And so I am also looking forward to seeing what comes out of COP in the future, and I'm hoping for a continued sort of upward trajectory in these discussions.
Great. Yeah, I'm also hoping that, this upward trajectory when it comes to China's capabilities will also be matched with capabilities in other parts of the world. We've seen several development initiatives kind of emerge in the past few years, including a partnership for global infrastructure and investment, as well as the EU Global Gateway. And some of our research has shown that, these initiatives have potential to kind of work together with the Belt and Road Initiative, given their similarities and the different types of financing instruments, as well as goals that they have. But we also recognize that in this geopolitical moment, that there's this time of competition, given even in the space of supporting several types of development finance projects, including energy projects all across the world. So we're hoping that a sense of healthy competition will lead to a scaling up of support for low carbon projects, greener projects, not just from China but others as well. And I think China will play a huge role in that, given their domestic capacity that has been discussed in today's conversation already. So with that, I want to thank everyone for, again, joining us on this webinar. I also want to thank you, Cecilia and Ashana, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And for those who shared some questions, this webinar has been recorded on YouTube, and we will share this link in the chat, as well as share it with those who signed up for this webinar. But to receive updates on our publications and events, you can subscribe to the Global China Initiative newsletter. So thank you all, and we will see you next time for our next webinar and database updates. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.